Now, an exploration of the lives of America's 43 first mothers and their influence on their sons. In discussing his book, Faith of Our Mothers, presidential scholar Harold Gullin asserts that presidential lineage is a neglected facet of American history. It's just over 50 minutes.
Folks, if I could have your attention, please, we'll try to get started. Welcome again to this opportunity to be at our senior brunch. I have a few comments of introduction to make about our speaker for today. Transition is a way of life, we are often told. Younger people, whatever that term may mean, will in all likelihood change jobs or vocations from 7 to 10 times during their vocational career. Statements like that, which you have probably heard often, are also followed with a caricature of the older generation who are said to have worked in the same place for a lifetime and have not needed to adapt so frequently. Well, statements like that are regularly shown to be untrue among the senior adults that I know, and that is certainly true of our speaker for today. Adaptability. Harold Gullin came last November to speak to our senior men's group on the results of the presidential election. He came on November 15th, when no results were yet known. He certainly had to adapt, and that he did well. There have been other radical changes for him in his life. In fact, he now refers to himself as an academic Grandma Moses. Why? Well, let me give you a quick overview. After graduation from Johns Hopkins, he moved into a career in advertising and marketing. After a goodly amount of time there, of all things, he decided to go back to school. Not, mind you, to increase his business skills, but to study education at St. Joseph's and then American history at Temple, graduating with an MA and then a PhD, respectively, from those institutions. Now that I think about it, maybe advertising and marketing weren't so disconnected from his next steps after all, because his interest went to history, and within history they went to the presidency. His doctoral dissertation was rewritten later to be readable, as often has to be done with doctoral dissertations, and it was published as a book on the presidential election between Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey, titled The Upset That Wasn't. Now, he has moved on to a new book, which you will hear about today, on a topic that has been too neglected, the president's mothers. I find it fascinating in a psychologized culture, which often blames everything on mothers, that no one has sought out the maternal influences on our nation's presidents. Well, our speaker for today has. Currently, he is serving in a teaching appointment in world civilization at LaSalle University, and we welcome Dr. Harold Gullin back to this church and to this congregation, and thanks to C-SPAN, to a wider audience as well. When he completes his remarks, you are invited to ask questions, and if you have a question, you'll be asked to go to the mic in the center of the room, but I will invite you to do that again when the time comes. For now, please welcome Dr. Harold Gullin.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Arnold, for that very gracious introduction, parts of which are true. I seem to be talking an awful lot. I'm an equal opportunity speaker, but I seem to be talking an awful lot to Presbyterians. And I must say, at the Chestnut Hill Presbyterian Church, there was more applause for the dessert than for me. But I am obliged to you for this very nourishing lunch and for the opportunity to inflict my thoughts on you. Fortunately, I brought a clock just in case there was not one here. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I tend to digress and to get into monologues. But in any case, I am teaching at LaSalle University, where all the students are above average. And where have I heard that before? And I'm just delighted to be back here again with you. Why did I write a book about the mothers of American presidents? Because I couldn't find one. There are so many books about first ladies, new one just last week, and they're fascinating. If you're interested in the great saga, the ongoing saga of American history, why are there no books about the parents of our presidents. I mean, Harry Truman once said, the only new thing in the world is the history we don't know. And so I decided to embark on this voyage of discovery. I don't mean to imply that I have a lot of discretionary time to pursue this investigation of the president's mothers. Why not the fathers? There's some wonderful fathers. I already knew before my boat embarked that fathers like Theodore Roosevelt's father, a wonderful man, one of the early New York philanthropists. John Adams' father, the parson, we're reading a lot about them now, wonderful man, and there are bound to be many others. But it did seem to me, for a variety of reasons, that the stories of the mothers of American presidents might be the more compelling. Some of those reasons are fairly obvious, of course. I knew that many of them were widows who were obliged to keep their families together. I surmised that, after all, women traditionally have been responsible for the nurturing of the young and the education of the young, and even in this country, until very recent years, have not had the opportunity to find fulfillment in their own careers, and so are obliged to find fulfillment in the careers of their husbands or of their favored sons. But it was more than that. This wonderful book that I wrote, The Upset That Wasn't, there are still copies selectively available, as I understand. This is about the most dramatic presidential election in American history. As indicated, the election in 1948, where Harry Truman is supposed to have pulled off the greatest upset in American political history. Of course, that is complete nonsense, but I'm not here to discuss that today. But I was struck in doing research for that book at how close his relationship was with his mother. She was his confidant. She was the repository of his hopes and dreams. And I thought, how universal is that? So then I wrote an article about Dwight Eisenhower. This sounds like my greatest hits, I guess. And I found that there it was even more clear. Dwight Eisenhower wrote, our mother was the inspiration of our lives. Our, meaning he and his brothers. And unlike some subsequent presidents of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower never had reason to be embarrassed by his brothers. All of them were successful. And if you had made a judgment, say in the 1920s, as to which Eisenhower boy was going to be the most successful, you would not have chosen Ike. It was called Little Ike originally. Indeed, you may recall that at the very height of Dwight Eisenhower's fame, a reporter sought out his mother in Abilene, Kansas, and asked her, the redoubtable Ida Stover Eisenhower, one of my favorite presidential mothers, as I began to learn more, and asked her, aren't you proud of your son? And she replied, I think quite honestly, which one? This was at the end of the Second World War. And what really turned me, though, finally into thinking why I should write this book was a television interview just last year. You know, a lot of people were talking about what is Bill Clinton's legacy? And there was an interview, Charlie Rose on PBS, and he had Chris Matthews, the political pundit who comes from Philadelphia and talks even faster than I do, and asked him how he felt about that. Matthews allowed us how, well, whatever his legacy was, it would have been so much more substantial if he had had a father figure to look up to and emulate. Well, wait a minute, I thought. Most of the presidents I knew anything about had mother figures to look up to and emulate, and so that's when I turned from thinking about this to writing it. And then being an equal opportunity historian, I went to the wonderful librarians at St. Joseph's University, and they found every book available of a biography of every president of the United States, all their memoirs, letters between they and their mothers, and we came to certain conclusions. And the first conclusion I reached was that, yes, by and large, for a variety of reasons, the mothers of our presidents have been more inspiring and more instrumental in their favored sons' successes than have the fathers. And that if there is one theme that one draws together from all this, it is the theme of faith. And that is why I call this book Faith of Our Mothers. Initially, of course, faith in the unlimited potential of their sons, irrespective of what career or calling they might follow. And often they were first sons or only sons, traditionally the repository of parental dreams. But often they were not, and the mother seems to know instinctively which son holds the most promise. But also faith in another dimension. A very high percentage of these women, even in the 19th century, And some of the most compelling stories were in the 19th century. I didn't want to write about just a handful of mothers in the 20th century. I wanted to write about them all. From Mary Washington, who just didn't get along with George very well, was not representative, to either Pauline Gore or Barbara Bush, both of whom I admired so much that didn't present a problem. But irrespective of their denomination, so many of them were devoutly religious. And indeed, if they had had their druthers, even though they're looking at higher aspirations generally, their sons would have been ministers of the gospel. In the case of Mother McKinley, who was actually called Mother McKinley because she was so popular in the country before we even had mass media. No, I did not know her personally. She prayed that someday her son William might be a Methodist bishop. But the aspirations generally were in terms of simply fulfilling your potential. And yet that is the potential that they hoped would be fulfilled. But in fact, only one young man who became a president of the United States actually set out initially to be a minister. And he was? I'm sorry, I'm used to teaching. At least you've got your heads up. This is a good sign. Woodrow Wilson, then Tommy Woodrow Wilson. And from the most ecclesiastical family of any American president. His mother's side, the Woodrows, were Presbyterian divines going all the way back to Scotland. His father, the redoubtable the Reverend Dr. Joseph Ruggles Wilson, had there been a Protestant pope, would have nominated his son. And his mother's affection was more unconditional, as is generally true of presidential mothers. So they sent him off to Davidson College in North Carolina, then is now the most distinguished liberal arts college in the South, where he apparently flourished, but at the end of his freshman year, he had either an emotional or physical breakdown, the kind of thing that was to recur in his life, and he had to withdraw. He took a year to somehow get over it, and when he went back to school, it was not to Davidson, but to Princeton, where he breezed through, just as any Davidson student could do today. And went not into the ministry, but of course into academia, and then into politics. The only academic to ever be elected president of the United States. But to the end of his life, you see the influence of that Presbyterian Covenanter theology. Indeed, ultimately, at the tragic end, he had pretty much abandoned any semblance of policy for prophecy. Is there a presidential mother who really wanted her son to be in politics? I'm not going to ask anymore. Rebecca Baines Johnson. And why? Because her father, who she revered, had so wanted to be the congressman from their hill country in Texas, and it failed. And so our son Lyndon, it'd be okay if he were president. She didn't live long enough to say it, but she wanted him to be member of Congress from the hill country of Texas. And it was a single-minded determination of her whole life. And when he finally won, I mean, she's almost like the female equivalent of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. without all the resources. But when he finally won at the age of 29, he won this very close Democratic primary. He wasn't called Landslide Lyndon for nothing. And went on to that job, and she could not contain her enthusiasm, even though her husband of 30 years, who she loved, was dying of heart disease. She wrote him this effusive letter. Congratulations, Congressman. Oh, if my father could be here to see this, the firstborn of his firstborn, ascending to this office that had been the goal of his life. How proud we are of you. Well, undoubtedly, there are other, I should have kept some water, I think, but you might want to get me some at your leisure. Undoubtedly, there are other mothers of American presidents who came to an understanding that they might be in politics and were agreeable to it, even though it might have been their original, might not have been their original goal. For example, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, who, after all, grew up in a political environment. I think once she realized that her sons were not likely to go into holy orders, was very supportive, and you remember how involved she was in their campaigns and how successful. I think Abigail Adams, about whom we think a lot now, probably foresaw that her son John Quincy might ultimately be president. She just didn't live to see it. That is the way in which she is different from Barbara Bush. Abigail Adams, the only other First Lady who was a First Mother, but unlike Barbara Bush, she did not live to see her son in the presidency. I'm sure she was more in favor of it than her husband, John, who, after all, had the unenviable task of succeeding George Washington, and who, irrespective of what you're reading, was a pretty irascible guy anyway. I thank you very much indeed. But what of all the others? What of all the others? How did they take it when their hopes and dreams were, so to speak, sidetracked? And all of their sons, after all, in a manner of speaking, they were all failures, weren't they? All of their sons went into politics, ultimately, generally into law. How did they take it? Now, this is a football Sunday, and I want Peter Munger to know we'll be out for the second half. And I'm obliged to you particularly for coming along because of that. But I was just thinking of a story I heard from a football coach, diminutive little Marv Levy. Do you remember Marv Levy? He was the longtime coach of the Buffalo Bills. Went to the Super Bowl 4 times, lost all 4 times. But a very congenial and very bright little man. And he had graduated from Coe College, the Davidson of the Midwest, with honors, and then went on to Harvard and got a master's. And his father, imagining that he would want to go into one of the learned professions, asked him, Marvin, what is it you plan to do with your life? And then after what I suppose is a long pause, he said, I want to be a football coach. And then his father, after what I surmise was an even longer pause, said, be a good one. That's precisely how these women viewed their sons going to politics. It might have not have been the career we hoped for, but be a good one. Don't compromise your integrity. Don't compromise your standards. Don't bring discredit on your family. The formidable Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Is there a more misunderstood first mother than she was so mean to poor Eleanor? That's how we know her. I'm going to be going in a couple of weeks to the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park to talk a little more about her. The fun about this kind of book is you can go to 100 venues and talk about 100 different people. I already have lined up going to the Reagan Museum in California to talk about his parents on Mother's Day, which is when I wanted this book to be published. But in any case, when she learned that her son, this formidable, domineering woman, thought she was more imperious than any queen, that her son, despite this crippling polio, would not follow her advice and go back to Hyde Park, to Hudson Valley squiredom, to a more sedentary life, she said, Franklin, it is your decision. He had pretty much decided to run for governor of New York. It is your decision. But if you do decide to run, and she controlled the family purse strings, I do not want you to be defeated. And she was, as you may recall, those of you of my chronology, very supportive and very visible for the rest of her life. You would see her in newsreels, almost as comforting a figure as Mother McKinley. And she probably didn't like everything about the New Deal. I suspect she wasn't crazy when he served hot dogs to the King and Queen of England at Hyde Park, but she was supportive and she was visible. She was a very, very interesting woman. There's a lot more to her than the way she dealt with Eleanor. And what of Mother McKinley? Mother McKinley, who hoped her son would be a Methodist bishop. When he was nominated for the presidency, and she was asked by a reporter, aren't you proud of your son? She said, no. I'm proud that the great giver has endowed me with such a blessing. And when he was elected, she said, I am happy for him, for his sake. And the night before the inauguration, she and he and her daughter-in-law prayed together, and she intoned over and over, Lord, keep him humble. Lord, keep him humble. The reason people loved her so much is she was just a regular person. She was so frugal that she went to the inauguration with the flowers she had gathered from the railroad train dining car. She made them her corsage. So many presidential fathers have viewed themselves as failures or have been thwarted in their ambitions for their own lives. I think that is the difference in finality. We're thwarted in their own ambitions. And they're somehow not able, after their own disappointments, to transpose their dreams for themselves to their sons. Now, the mothers invariably are. I mean, what was it that Dwight Eisenhower's father really wanted? He wanted to be an engineer. Why couldn't his stubborn Dutch father understand he wasn't cut out to be a farmer? What was it that Ronald Reagan's father really wanted? He wanted to have the largest shoe store in Illinois. Is that so unreasonable? Why was there always depression, always a problem? What was it that Harry Truman's father really wanted? He wanted to invest in something, like his friend Kemper, all commodities, livestock, something that would yield him a profit. Why did he have to go back to the farm? All these guys talk about farming but hate it. What is it that Richard Nixon's father really wanted? He just wanted to have a lemon grove in soil that would prosper. But it was always sandy soil. There was always something wrong. They were thwarted in their own ambitions. I mean, what did Abraham Lincoln's father view success as? It was constituted by a more bountiful farm. It was always somewhere over the horizon. If we have to move from Kentucky, we'll go to Indiana. If we have to move from Indiana, we'll go to Illinois. It was always just over the horizon. And there's so many of these stories over and over. Grover Cleveland's father, who was a Presbyterian clergyman, as many of you may know, and a brilliant man. All he wanted was to be able to settle in one community, in one parish, and flourish sufficiently so that he could give his sons, especially Grover, the opportunity for a college education as he had had, but he failed. He wasn't meant to be a preacher. He was meant to be a teacher. And even the presidential fathers who succeeded in the Jeffersonian tradition of self-made men, what did they want their sons to be? Well, of course they wanted them to come into the business with them. Ulysses, what is wrong with you? We've got this great tannery here. Oh, it doesn't smell that good. But why do you hate it so? Why, your brothers are coming in with me? I mean, why are you so somber? Why are you so secretive? Why are you so silent? You know, you're kind of like your mother. Maybe it would be a good idea for you to go to West Point. Make something of yourself and go a century later. Jimmy, look at all these peanuts. I mean, we're building a business here in all directions. Come on, Hot, come back with me. Eventually it'll be yours. You can take it over. You want to go to college? I'll send you to Georgia Tech. What's all this about going to the Naval Academy? You see a lot of water around here? And on and on. Richard Nixon, asleep at night, or supposedly asleep, hearing the railroad cars, the railroad trains, wondering where they went, how he could get on one. If faith is the theme of this book, faith of our mothers, the secondary theme is escape. So many of these young men who became our presidents wanted to escape from the circumstances of their childhood, whether affluent or destitute. And in many instances, it was very destitute. And often that meant escaping from even the well-intentioned failures of their fathers, and even sometimes the well-intended successes of their fathers, but never from the inspiration of their mothers, who in most cases was really kind of a co-conspirator in enabling their sons to escape to a life of their own, even though they understood that it would inevitably mean a separation, and often a very painful separation. You remember the last thing that Richard Nixon said as president, the last speech he made, that rambling, emotional speech, and he bemoaned his father's bad luck, and he called his mother a saint. And he was not far wrong. You ever read the book Friendly Persuasion, or seen the movie on which it was based? And that gentle Quaker mother, I think the late Dorothy McGuire, that woman is based on Hannah Nixon. Now, I'd like to go on like Fidel Castro and talk for 4 or 5 hours, but given the constraints of time, I'd like to just end in my customarily convoluted way before hopefully you'll ask questions or make comments, which are much more interesting to me. I much prefer a conversation, believe it or not, to an oration. I just want to talk briefly about 3 representative presidential mothers who seem very different, but I'm not sure they are. Cheers. We have had 4 presidents of the United States who have been assassinated. In that sense, we have been rather fortunate. We could have had a dozen easily. But of the 4 who were killed, 3 of their mothers outlived them. Now, of course, the longest, the most extended, is Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. But in the case of Abraham Lincoln, it was not his mother, it was his stepmother. His birth mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, who would urge him from his earliest recollections to "Larn all you can, Abe, larn all you can," died when he was only 9 or 10. And a year later, his stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, with 3 children of her own, she was a widow, married his father, came back from Kentucky with books, among other things, thankfully, and somehow turned the chaos of that little cabin they lived in into order. And if Lincoln loved his mother, as he did, he adored his stepmother. After he was killed, she reflected on the nature of their relationship. She said, among other things, "I can say what not one woman in 1,000, her mother, can say. Abe never gave me a cross word in all his life. His mind and mine, what little I have, seem to run together." You know, he visited me after he was elected president, and she was very fearful about what might happen. I think he loved me truly. I had another son named John. He and Abe grew up together, and they were both good boys. But I think I can say now, both having died, that Abe was the best boy I ever saw or ever hoped to see. Now, Sarah Delano Roosevelt would have phrased that differently, but is it not the same sentiment? The president's mother I was asked about most until just a few weeks ago was, of course, Bill Clinton's. How does Virginia Kelly fit into all this? Fun-loving, married 4 times. Well, she certainly wasn't one of the most devout presidential mothers, but I think in terms of the fundamentals of faith, is there any doubt that Billy Clinton was at the absolute center of her consciousness every day of her life since he was born? If there is a difference between she and other presidential mothers, it seems to me that in most instances, the mother is the inspiration of the son. In this instance, I think perhaps the son was the inspiration of the mother, the stable center of her life. Women were fighting over Bill Clinton from the day he was born. I'll discuss that somewhere. And I think it goes a long way to at least understanding the subsequent ambivalence of his own life. Barbara Pierce Bush, First Lady, First Mother, First Stepmother, First Homemaker, really, calls herself just a mom, as if that isn't some tremendous achievement. Why do so many people hold her in such high esteem, irrespective of how they feel about politics? Well, I think to some extent it may have something to do with things that she has done. She, as First Lady, had that notable campaign for literacy, but I think far more than that. It's what we perceive her to be. She knows who she is, and she is completely comfortable with it. There is no artificiality there. And Americans crave and appreciate authenticity. And why not? How often do we see it in our public figures? If you doubt that that quality is unique, just go within that proverbial beltway and observe the great industry of Washington, which is the creation of artificial image. There is still a lot of the spunk and spontaneity of young Barbara Pierce, who was the ringleader of her little crowd in Rye, New York, even as she was First Lady and First Mother. For example, when her husband was elected president, they went over to see Margaret Thatcher in London, and he ceremoniously kissed her hand. What did Barbara Bush do? She kissed the hand of Dennis Thatcher. How many First Ladies would do that? Okay? Her life has not been devoid of challenge. You can imagine a young wife and mother from the environs of Rye and from Greenwich, Connecticut, making the transition to Odessa, Texas. It's a different world. And her first daughter, Robin, died of leukemia, and it was then that her hair turned so suddenly gray. And as I understand, it was the aftermath of that that built that very strong relationship she has with her oldest son, George Walker. And she tried, she writes, once to color her hair. She used something called Fabulous Fawn. It turned out not to be so fabulous. And that was it, forget it, that was it. Now, I'm sure that even today, she would be more comfortable and happier just telling, reading stories to toddlers, her own children, her own grandchildren, and so on, toddlers. And that's genuine. But it seems to me that it was a speech, a set-piece speech, which she doesn't like to give, that defines in perpetuity who she is and what she believes. You may recall that it was given at Wellesley College in 1990 to the graduating seniors, a quarter of whom had strenuously objected to her being invited to be their commencement speaker. Why? Because these career-minded young women felt that, after all, Mrs. Bush, if she has any fame or notoriety, it is, heaven forbid, in the image of her husband. But probably to the immense relief of the administration of Wellesley, she decided to show up. I think she took Riza Gorbachev with her. There's a combination for you. And in a few well-chosen, dignified, poised, and sometimes humorous words, she completely won over that audience, including her detractors. She said in part, "At the end of your life, you will never regret not having passed one more test or made one more deal or achieved one more verdict. But you will regret time not spent with a husband, with a child, with a friend, or with a parent." And then she went on, looking over that audience. Who knows, somewhere out there may even be someone who one day will follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse. And I wish him well. Well, may I say on this lovely day that I wish each of you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gullin. And now it is your opportunity, if you wish, to make comments or ask questions. This is your opportunity to ask anything you ever wanted to know about a president's mother but were afraid to ask. If you do have questions or comments, please come to the microphone in the center so that we can pick up your question. Gordon, if you could. Sure.
You haven't mentioned the relationship between presidents' mothers and presidents' wives. Which one had the worst relationship and which the best, or some such elements?
You want to handle that? You promised it would be softball questions. I'm normally asked about the relationship between the president's mothers and their wives, or between the president's mothers and their fathers, which was sometimes tumultuous. I suspect that because, bear in mind that we know so much more about some of these women than others, there are about a dozen who, through a variety of reasons, mainly the lack of the literature, we know next to nothing about. There had only been 2 prior books before mine of all, in terms of all the mothers, presidents and mothers. There's a very good book that just came out this year, oddly enough, about just the mothers in the 20th century named First Mothers, and which I encourage you to read. I don't like to quote Chairman Mao, but there are too few flowers in this particular garden. Now in all of American history, there are 2 books that are out of print. Now there are 2 books that are in print. I'd love to talk on a platform with that lady, Bonnie Angelo, who's an excellent writer, and just talk about American presidents. But I guess ultimately I'm going to have to try to deal with your question. I suppose, in my own convoluted fashion, I suppose that because it is so well documented, the relationship of Sarah Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt was probably the most discordant throughout. Sarah always felt that she was not only a better mother, but pretty much should dominate everything. You know, her gift to her children after they got married, and Franklin couldn't understand why Eleanor was in tears, was 2 townhouses on 65th Street with a connecting, corridor so she could come in and preside over dinner. She did have the family purse strings, so whenever they went even to Hyde Park, so long as she lived, she sat at the head of the table. Franklin didn't imagine there was any real problems with that, and of course, as you know, he did have the one relationship that his mother broke up, which we don't have really time to go into. But I would say that so far as we know, and we don't know enough, there isn't enough literature about this. That's the problem. About, as I say, about 12 of these mothers, I really couldn't write an awful lot. It's hard to bring them back to life. But there are over 30. Of the over 30 who we do know something about, I would say that the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and her mother-in-law was probably the worst. Now, what was the best? There are a great many that were very good, because a lot of presidential wives are also very religious. I mean, Jessie Wilson loved, even though she hated to give him up, loved the wife of Woodrow Wilson, both wives really, Woodrow Wilson, because they were so, in a way, they're so similar. A lot of presidents married women who reminded them of their mothers. But I would say perhaps one of the best relationships, to kind of cop out of this, is the current one. Obviously, Barbara Bush is extremely fond of her daughter-in-law, and I think they have a great many qualities in common, and both, in a manner of speaking, really shaped that guy up. I'm sorry, I don't have any short answers to anything, but I do my best. Yes, ma'am. Could you come to the microphone, please?
I was present at the graduation ceremony when Barbara Bush made her famous remark about hoping that he would follow in her footsteps.
You're a graduate of Wellesley?
It brought down the house, but Rosa Gorbachev never cracked a smile.
She probably had a bad interpreter. They had limited liquidity in the Kremlin at that time, you know. I read a little. I mentioned Rosa Gorbachev. I don't often know why I make these intrusive comments, but because she also spoke to the graduates, as I understand it. It was translated, and she gave the customary, speech about the world of tomorrow, and as I understand it, and the rest. And it got perfunctory applause, but I mean, that illustrates the difference between a kind of professional first lady and a kind of spontaneous first lady. Thank you very much. I'm most interested in that. How about Millard Fillmore's mother? Yes, sir.
I can think of at least two and maybe more brothers of presidents who were brought up by the same mother, but who did not turn out anywhere near as well as the president did. Is there any pattern of that kind that you saw?
That's a very, very excellent question. I think I should get the apple. I think that in many instances where there were not only sons, the mother made this judgment of who was the favorite son. For example, Rebecca Baines Johnson really focused everything on Lyndon. That's an extreme case. To the deprivation, I think, of his brothers. I think there's a certain amount of jealousy here. Sometimes they weren't even right. The mother of William Howard Taft thought that he was definitely foremost. He was a very nice man, but he had the judicial temperament of his father, and the pressures were terrible, not only on he, but on his brothers. A lot of parental pressures are excessive. There wasn't really time to talk about it. But I'm not really a psychohistorian, although that's very, very fashionable currently. And I can only suspect that in most cases it was because so much emphasis was placed on, on that specific person. Clinton, Bill Clinton had a stepbrother, and he tried very hard to kind of mold him and shape him up. I mean, there's a lot to be said favorably about Bill Clinton, but it never worked. But I think that when you have a sibling who is extremely prominent, of course, this is something my family faces every day, and the others aren't, there is undoubtedly sibling rivalry that can last lifelong. That's why I think the Eisenhower boys are so extraordinary. The youngest son, was president of 3 great universities. That's the rarity. There are so many presidential families that are kind of dysfunctional. And great men frequently have sons and daughters who don't shape up. I mean, look at the Roosevelt children, look at the Churchill children. When you have this really strong personality, they just can't, they can't deal with it. Look at the whole history of the Adams Chronicles of that family and their suicides. Look at the Theodore Roosevelt family and their mental breakdowns and the rest. I just think if the one son gets all the attention, and today, Lord willing, it might be the one daughter, the others suffer as a result. That's the best answer I can give you.
Being a Virginian and the state that produced 8 presidents, my favorite has been Thomas Jefferson. And did you find out anything about his mother?
Well, it's very strange. We all have theories about Thomas Jefferson, don't we? There's a new book about him every week. He is the most complex and also the most intellectual president. I'm not an academic. Jefferson wrote so copiously about everything, but he only wrote enough about his father so that we knew that he admired him tremendously. Self-made man, self-taught man, loved learning for its own sake, was really kind of the personification of the aristocracy of achievement that Jefferson wanted for this country. Now, why did he write so little about his mother? Why did he destroy their letters? He destroyed his wife's letters too. Now, maybe there's some relationship to women here that, generally. But by all accounts, unlike Mary Washington, who could be kind of irascible. I mean, her husband died when George was 11 and she wanted him to take over the household. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was only 14 when his father died. He lived a lot longer with his mother. And by all accounts, she was the most congenial and gracious person. Why does he seem to either resent her so or not want to talk about her at all? I would suspect, it's only my theory, we all have theories about Jefferson, that after his father died, she kind of controlled the family purse strings. And he wanted to go off to college. He wanted to get away from that household of women. Again, there's this view of women. But I think he may also have almost resented her aristocratic background because it didn't fit in. Now, he used it when he wanted to get married. I say, all these guys, the way to upward mobility is to marry above yourselves. There's no better example of that than our founding fathers and the fathers of our founding fathers. But I think he kind of resented the fact. Read about the way he describes in those few words her lineage, and make of that what you will. He says something to that effect to the reader. He's writing his autobiography years and years and years after his mother died. And when there's a fire at her house, he said the most terrible thing is it burned all of his books. I mean, he seems somehow to resent her. Now, my suspicion is that it's involved in some convoluted way. And even though nobody can figure Jefferson out, they keep writing books about him. One of his best biographers, Merrill Peterson, said, despite the vast corpus of letters, public and private, I think Jefferson's personality will always remain elusive, and then he writes another book. But it's fascinating, though. But I think he resented the aristocratic background of his mother because it didn't quite fit with his conception of what this new country was supposed to be about. Many thanks. Yes, ma'am. Now, we've got to get out in time for the second half, Yoder.
I plan to read your book. I'm going to give it as a Christmas gift to
More
some
power
of
to you.
my friends.
Quantity discounts.
But I am curious about Mary Washington. Can you just give us a little bit more about her life?
How much time do you have? I'm only signed out for another few minutes. Mary Washington was a widow when she married George Washington's father. And when he died, she decided not to pursue the normal course of women in those days, especially women of gentle background, and that is to get remarried. She insisted she was going to make it on her own. So you see a lot of this stubborn independence of George and his mother. I think George resented the fact that when his father died, and if he cut down cherry trees, it had to be at a tender age. His father died when he was 11, and they were moving around from one farm to another. His father was very involved in a lot of things, like all of the fathers of the founders. And I think he resented that his mother wanted him to be the man of the household. His half-brothers had all had the opportunity to be educated at the Appleby School in London. Washington never went out of the country except once, the Caribbean. He never saw a great city like London. And then the other Virginia presidents, 2 of the 3, went to William and Mary, at least for 2 years. Washington resented that he was unable, and he blamed her, I think. He was unable to have the same education as his half-brothers. You'll notice he didn't like to talk a great deal. He was an early example, without in any way denigrating his greatness, of image building. He'd walk into that Continental Congress wearing a uniform. What was he trying to tell them? You know, he didn't have to say anything. He had that commanding bearing, and of course he was so much taller than everyone except Jefferson. I think he resented her because he blamed her for the fact that he had not been educated, and there wasn't anything in the world he wanted to do less than to become the man of that bustling household at the age of 11. He was the oldest boy. I think he resented that terribly, and they just didn't get along. She doesn't seem to have taken any great pleasure in his achievements later in life. And she was always demanding that he pay her money, that she was bereft, that she was starving. And ultimately, when she went to Fredericksburg to live in a little house next to her daughter, her married daughter, she even wrote to, I believe, the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Mind you, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, they were going to pass a resolution for a pension for Washington's mother because he wasn't taking care of her. They didn't get along. And finally, I'd like to discuss this at great length, if I might, but finally, near the end of her life, as she was declining physically and maybe mentally, he wrote her a very nice letter. He used to write everybody else in the family, complaining about everything in Congress, but he didn't write her except in a very perfunctory way. Obviously, they just didn't get along, although I think he inherited a lot of her characteristics. And he said to her, "Mother, I think it's time for you to live with one of your children. Now, of course, don't come to Mount Vernon." You know, this is like this is like a well-connected, I think he said, tavern. I mean, we got people in and out of here all the time. You know, you don't want to come here. It would be just too much turmoil for you. But live with one of your other children, you know, and I'll work it out. For a time, he used his brother to be a surrogate, especially when he was terribly busy, to deal with her as a kind of buffer between the two. Early on, of course, in the biographies of Jefferson, how could the mother or the father of our country be anything but a perfect mother? There is a college named for her in Virginia. You can't say that of Jefferson's mother. But later, there's a kind of revisionist, there's always revision. Without revisionism, there's no historians, you know. Later, now she's become this terrible harridan, you know. She may have even been mentally ill or whatever. Well, it's not true. She was a woman of very strong character, and she was a woman of great independence. And I believe that in a way, he inherited a lot of her qualities without realizing it. And I don't know that whether he was resentful of that or not, but they just never got along. I know, again, that's rather convoluted, but in a short space of time, if you want to talk with me on the way out, I'll discuss it further. They just never got along. So she's not really a representative presidential mother, and yet I think she was a woman ahead of her time, an independent woman who wanted to run things for herself. And I believe, as some of his childhood acquaintances pointed out, there was a lot of her in him, whether he recognized it or not.
How about Abraham Lincoln's mother, or was it a stepmother?
Well, it was a mother and a stepmother.
Yeah, well, how about them?
Well, Lincoln wrote about his childhood when he ran for office. They asked him, we want to do some campaign literature for you. He had some handlers. He said, it's the simple annals of the poor. What can you say? It was just utter destitution. And I'm surprised that he didn't mention either his mother or his stepmother in that context, because he obviously loved them both. And if his childhood was so bereft of comfort and luxury, if anyone brightened it, it was those two ladies who were with him, all of his life. The first, unfortunately, died of what was called milk sickness. When you had a fever in those days, that was that. And so she died too young to have a profound effect. But they both tried very hard, A, to get him in school, any kind of school, even the blab schools of Kentucky, and B, to get him to encourage him to read. Now, mind you, his first mother, his birth mother, could read. His stepmother could neither read nor write. But as I say, they encouraged him to learn all you can. They seemed to sense there was something great about him. That's the thing about these women. They sensed there was something great about him. Now, Lincoln even speculated that perhaps his mother's mother was illegitimate, and that he really bore in his, the blood of a Virginia gentleman. He always felt, for all that amiability, he always was a little apart, He always had that kind of somber sensitivity and all that. For all of his friendship to other people and all of his gregariousness, he kept part of himself away. I think he felt really kind of superior. to his childhood friends. And I think he suspected that that came from his birth mother, because he said, "Everything I am or ever hope to be," he said to Herndon, his law partner, who spent 26 years writing the first really good biography of Lincoln because he tippled a lot, "Everything I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." His mother was then dead. Is he referring to her in heaven, or did he mean his stepmother, who he clearly adored more than anyone in this world? He only went to school in total, despite all their best efforts, despite their insisting to his father that when he wanted to read, you let him read, you leave him alone. He only went to school a total of 1 year in his whole life. His successor, Andrew Johnson, never went to school a single day in his life. As I say, there's a lot of destitution in some of these 19th century families. But there's no doubt whatever that while he couldn't accept fully their religious convictions, which were also very strong, they were both deeply religious. His mother is quoted as saying, if I could have a farm or learn the Bible, I'd rather learn the Bible. Deeply religious. He respected that, and you know how much he used scriptures in his speeches, and that was their influence as Baptists. But I don't think he could fully accept their faith. We don't want to get into this either, but to the extent that they believed it. But I think he loved his mothers, and I think that both of them, who were, between the two, they were with him all of his life. I think they were the only real brightness, except for the one early romance he had, and she died, which made him more somber in his life, in his childhood. When he visited his mother's grave years and years later, he couldn't bring himself to say anything. He expressed himself in poetry, which is very poignant. One of the fun things about a book like this, of course, is a voyage of discovery for the writer as well as for the readers, is you find out things you didn't know anything about, that you didn't suspect. I mean, Calvin Coolidge only reached eloquence once in his life, talking about his mother. Wouldn't have imagined that. Herbert Hoover's even eloquent sometimes. But Lincoln undoubtedly adored both of his mothers.
You may have done it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Harold Gullin teaches world civilization at LaSalle University and is the author of Faith of Our Mothers, the stories of presidential mothers from Mary Washington to Barbara Bush. It's published by William B. Erdmans. And for more information, visit them on the web at erdmans.com.